So you may have heard this term eco-anxiety. I think you have an intuitive sense of what that means. And you think it's all coming from what is happening with climate change. But I always wonder, what role do we as climate scientists play in that when we keep saying that things will only get worse? How sure are we about what will get worse where? Is it okay to tell everybody everything is going to get worse everywhere? And if so, are we telling them how to prepare other than to say we need climate action? Well, climate action is not easy when there is money involved and there are profits and losses involved. So let's look at this nice topic here with a little news article that analysis type article that came in Nature. I'll start with these graphs. Countries searching the most for queries related to climate anxiety. Global search interest over the past 5 years. This is from BBC. They took it from Global Trends. So you can see the number here percentage wise. Peak search interest. Canada is up. US is much lower. And Europe, parts of Europe are much higher. India is somewhere here. You don't get, Google in China, but there are other countries. Africa, for whatever reason, there are few countries, and then the distribution is uneven even in North Africa into Europe and so on and so forth. So what is it that makes people eco-anxious? You can also take surveys like this. This is from Densuoken. It's an institute in Japan or a company. Please read the following statements and indicate if they apply to you. This was a survey. I'll show a couple of these surveys. It's a nice report. You can go and read from this link here. I'm worried that climate change threatens people and the planet. So what are the answers? Worried, not worried. So here you have extremely worried, very worried, moderately worried, a little worried, not worried, and prefer not to say. There are even people who prefer not to say. Philippines is up here. Of course, they are facing typhoons and they are told that global warming is going to make it much worse, and whatever perception they have about what's happening is obviously adding to it. India, surprisingly, Brazil, Portugal, France, developed countries way behind. So very worried is small, moderately worried, and a little worried. Australia, Nigeria, Japan is low on this, but they will show up as higher on some other measures. So it really depends on how you ask the question. And here is USA. And everywhere the other issue to worry about is whether people's beliefs or need for action is actually translating to climate action interest from the politicians, or are the politicians able to ignore the people's interest because of money coming from the energy industry and so on, or coal miners, etc. Right? The second question they asked is, does climate change make you feel any of the following? So anxious, afraid, sad, powerless, helpless, and ashamed, optimistic, hurt, indifferent, angry, guilty, and so on and so forth. And they put the Japanese percentages versus the 10 other countries in the previous list: Australia, Finland, France, Portugal, UK, US, Brazil. I won't go too much into it, but you can see that depending on how you ask the question, the response may be different, which is very common for surveys. So in India, if you ask, have you heard of climate change? Answer may be no, but if you ask in other ways, it turns out that they do know about climate change. It's just the way we interpret climate change is different than the way they interpret. Okay, and my feelings about climate change negatively affect my daily life. At least one of the following: eating, concentrating, work, school, sleeping, spending time in nature, playing, having fun, and relationships. Again, Philippines says yes to many of these questions, and then comes India, which is also highly affected by these questions in terms of negatively affecting daily life. USA, of course, not so worried. let's go to the article then. The Bahamas is vulnerable to storms and hurricanes. Extreme weather can exacerbate mental health illness. So this is from a recent article in 2024 from Nature. The rise of eco-anxiety. Researchers are waking up to mental health toll of climate change around the world, from lives that are disrupted by catastrophic weather to people who are anxious about the future. So every year for I'm just going to take bits and pieces of the article to keep this brief. You can read, it's a fairly short article anyway. Every year for 6 years, Laureen Wamaita hoped that her fields in Kenya would flourish. Every year she would see drought, wither the crops, and then floods wash them away. So you're getting smacked both ways. The cycle of optimism and loss left her constantly anxious, and she blamed climate change. You get to a situation where you have panic attacks because you are always worried about something, she says. So we'll come back and see her statement at the end as well. Medical student Vashti Eve Burrows, meanwhile, saw powerful Hurricane Dorian rage through the Bahamas in 2019, and now she's fearful about the future of the country, an island archipelago that is vulnerable to sea level rise and storms. Sea level rise can, sink part of the island, and then storms come and almost drown it for a while. So, I lost my place here. Medical student Vashti Eve that we were talking about, now she is fearful about the future of the country, an island archipelago that's vulnerable to sea level rise and storms. Will there even be a Bahamas in maybe 20 to 30 years? That's a fairly existential fear. Wamaita and Burrows are part of a growing chorus of people speaking up about the impacts of climate change on mental health. Climate change is exacerbating mental disorders, which already affect almost 1 billion people and are among the world's biggest causes of ill health. A global survey in 2021 found that more than half of the people aged 16 to 25 felt sad, anxious, and powerless, or had other negative emotions about climate change. Well, when you say climate change impacts on health, you have to be careful, because air pollution is the big killer, and air pollution is part of climate change, but not always. Altogether, in the sense you can be drying land, producing dust, PM 2.5, vehicles, emissions, PM 2.5, and so on. Altogether, hundreds of millions of people might be experiencing some type of negative psychological response to climate crisis. And jumping ahead, a seam of climate injustice is exposed by research. Young people are likely to experience the greatest mental burden from climate change that older generations have caused. Groups of people that already experience poverty, illness, or inequalities are most at risk of deteriorating mental health. Climate change exacerbates already existing economic situations where it's the poorer people who are feeling even worse, says Jennifer Uchendu, a researcher, climate activist, and founder of Susti Vibes, an environmental group based in Lagos, Nigeria. Jump ahead again, look at how reach on climate change impacts such as drought affect mental health, and how that is all growing. So you can see everybody is congregating to these little bits of water that are barely there, and you can see animals and human beings, and in fact that's their livelihood, because these are herders who rely on grazing these little animals for milk and food and so on. The fact that climate change affects people's mental health is not surprising. What's new is the attention the issue is attracting, and the myriad ways that scientists are documenting its varied and sometimes shocking effects. It's well known that extreme weather events and disasters can have an immediate traumatic impact, as well as a long tail of mental health conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, substance abuse, says Emma Lawrence, who studies mental health at Imperial College London. Also, taking a mental health toll in vulnerable countries are less sudden but nonetheless devastating disruptions caused by global warming's impacts, such as forced migration, loss of livelihoods, food insecurity, and community breakdown. Violence goes up as well. Okay, that's what often causes forced migration. Studies also suggest that people with existing mental illness are at great risk of dying during extreme heat, but understanding why that is and what we can do to stop it is really unexplored. Attribution is important. If excess deaths during a heat wave accounts for more mentally ill people dying, then that tells you that it may have something to do with heat waves. Then you have to go and figure out whether they were not capable of seeking help, or whether they just didn't realize they were dying, and so on and so forth, right? So one potential explanation is that some psychiatric drugs can interfere with the body's response to heat. That's even more complicated. You've taken some drug that's telling you it's not turning on the body's alarm that there is a heat wave and you need to save yourself. Okay? So eco-anxiety goes global. Another striking field of research examines how the awareness of climate change and its impacts can lead to concern or distress, a phenomenon sometimes called eco-anxiety, eco-distress, climate grief, or solastalgia, which is distress linked to environmental change. Solastalgia, there you go, another new word that I read and I didn't look up actually. In a 2018 survey, 72% of people aged 18 to 34 said that negative environmental news stories affected their emotional well-being, such as by causing anxiety, racing thoughts, or sleep problems. A 2020 survey in the United Kingdom found that young people aged 16 to 24 reported more distress from climate change than from COVID-19. Again, you have to figure out whether this is about the experience they are having or the messages they are getting from climate scientists and the media that the world is coming to an end. So we have to be careful about what we say, right? Feelings of eco-anxiety are not necessarily a sign of dysfunction, though. If you are under immediate threat, it's a realistic, rational, healthy survival instinct to react by being anxious or to experience fear, says Elizabeth Marks, a clinical psychologist at the University of Bath, UK, and one of the survey's lead authors. It could even be harmful to think of these feelings as a disorder. If we think of it as a diagnosable condition that If we think of it as a diagnosable condition that risks placing the blame on the individual as having an unhealthy response, she says, okay, I didn't read it properly. If we think of it as a diagnosable condition that risks placing the blame on the individual as having an unhealthy response, instead of saying that's the natural and acceptable, understandable response, she says. That said, some people might become so impaired by the eco-distress that they would benefit from psychological health. What is beyond the Western view? The full effects of climate change on mental health are hard to measure. Combination of factors, including the stigma around mental health and lack of access to health care services, mean that many people with mental health concerns go undiagnosed. When Wamaita talked to her family in Kenya about how worried she was, they would say, it's not a big deal, it's part of life, she says. Fatalistic view. Anxiety and depression are barely recognized as disorders in a region, she says. Mental health services are scarce, and older people just think that you are very sensitive because they survived droughts in the past. In the 2021 survey, nearly 40% of the young people worldwide said their concerns about climate change had been ignored or dismissed. So they are protesting, of course, with Greta Thunberg and so on, that says that they are worried and they want politicians to do something. But of course, the kids don't have a full view of how decisions are made and how hard it is to put climate action on the front burner all the time when you have so many other things going on, like the pandemic or wars or economic downturns and so on. So climate anxiety around the world, again to add to the survey from the Japanese company, young people everywhere are worried about climate change, according to a 2021 global survey of 10,000 people aged 16 to 25. Those in low-income countries and regions that are affected by climate change reported greater levels of concern and distress. How worried are you about climate change? Very, extremely, moderate, little, not worried. So we looked at this already. Slightly different orders, again based on how questions are asked and when they are asked. And Philippines again comes up on top. India is second here. Climate change negatively affects my daily life and functioning. Again, India comes up on top here, and Philippines is almost the same. So you have to understand why Indians or Philippines may be particularly feeling anxious about these things. Overcoming eco-distress, addressing climate-fueled mental health conditions will be a colossal task when mental health care globally is already poor. Only around 3% of the people with depression receive adequate treatment in low and lower middle-income countries, and 23% in high-income countries. Most people don't want to admit that they have mental problems, and even if a kid tells the parents may just say, be tough, or don't be a baby, and all sorts of things to dismiss the concerns, right? So Laurence says that many communities are finding their own ways to cope, but that the effectiveness of these efforts is rarely studied and shared. There's a massive gap around the evaluation, she says. So if many people are feeling the anxiety, then maybe they can get together and say, hey, there is a problem, instead of an individual, right? Depression could be an individual problem when it's physiological or by birth and so on, whereas climate anxiety is a shared experience which may be more easily expressed than mental illness. Some evidence suggests that taking action to combat climate change can help people to manage eco-anxiety. There does seem to be an argument for supporting people to take collective action, says Marx, such as joining campaign groups with like-minded people. It's also important to recognize that I feel this way because I care, she says, and these climate emotions are actually something to be honored and allowed, not pushed away. Marx also suggests that some people who are feeling eco-distress limit the amount of time they spend doom scrolling through climate news. So if you keep searching for a word, then the search media will keep serving the same kind of news to you. So you might think, wow, the world is coming to an end, whereas you're just getting into confirmation bias. Wamaita, who along with Burroughs is one of many people who shared their experiences with Connecting Climate Minds, has turned some of her concerns into action. Feeling engaged reduces anxiety. Last year, after trying and failing to grow drought-resistant crops, she quit farming and is now working at a non-governmental organization in Bura, Kenya, that is focused on poverty relief. She is earning enough to study for a master's degree in public health, and she raises awareness of global health on the social networking site LinkedIn. But she is anxious about the future and worries about whether to have children. I don't think I am in a good environment to be able to bring kids into this particular place, she says, and that is the saddest thing when I think about it. Burroughs, we mentioned before, who is studying medicine at the University of West Indies in St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago, says she chooses to be positive and does small things to help the environment, such as walking instead of driving. She says that she prays that wealthy countries and companies will really truly understand what's happening and not just say smooth words to try to pacify us in the moment. They should act to help the smaller countries and the world at large. These are good thoughts, but rich countries are not always keen to admit their historic responsibility, nor start handing out money, not even transfer technology and knowledge to help the poor. So that's a very complicated issue overall. I think that was the end of the PowerPoint. Yeah. So this topic is good and it is important, but overall how we portray the climate impact, the future of expected climate impacts and what we can do about it, Kids need an optimistic vision, in my view. I've talked about it elsewhere. Sometimes we're using hyperbole to, even describe our forecasts. And it may not turn out to be right, but then we say global warming made it difficult, or that global warming exacerbated or made this event worse, and so on. Even those have unintended consequences potentially. So this is a difficult business, but nonetheless it is true that climate anxiety is there, is maybe growing. So we need more action, but what does that mean? That's a separate topic that I discuss a lot in adaptation and mitigation, for example. Okay, let me leave it here.